Hello, and welcome back to the reading of White Rage, the Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. We have been working through this book together through the intensity and the heaviness of it and being able to identify how it still relates to today. If you are just joining, we are on page 108. The chapter is Rolling Back Civil Rights. We're going to be starting at the first full paragraph, which starts after the quote. The Rolling Back Civil Rights chapter, just to kind of get everybody kind of caught up, is essentially what it says, rolling back civil rights. Once the South and politicians realized what the civil rights meant for Black people, then of course they wanted to roll them back because white supremacy and racism. Indeed, the impact of the Voting Rights Act was profound. Just prior to its passage, only 6.7% of Black adults were registered to vote in Mississippi. 3 years later, with federal oversight and Section 5 preclearance that required the Department of Justice or a district court in Washington, D.C. to approve any changes to the state's election laws, the number of Black registered voters had skyrocketed to 59.4%. Because the Voting Rights Act was clearly working, the first civil rights legislation Nixon sent to Congress proposed eliminating Section 5 and stretching the VRA's scope to the entire country. Far from trying to disfranchise Black voters, Nixon disingenuously explained the amended legislation sought simply to address an imbalance that when other areas of the nation also discriminated against segments of their citizenry, left the South unfairly singled out. What eventually became clear during the congressional hearings, however, was that Nixon's new civil rights legislation would create a wholly uncivil America. With the entire nation covered, the Attorney General admitted, it would be impossible for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice to screen every voting change in every county in the nation. And thus, his staff would be unable to enforce the Voting Rights Act at all. Those who believed their rights had been violated at the ballot box, Mitchell continued, just needed to go through the courts. In essence, Nixon's plan was to hurl African Americans and the nation back to the slow, litigious route carved out in the long since discredited Civil Rights Act of 1957. During the VRA's extension hearings, South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond embraced the Nixon administration's idea as he floated a narrative of racial innocence that minimized the terror and walled off the brutal history of disfranchisement. Thurmond was emphatic that it was just wrong to continually charge a state and a people with any alleged injustice that occurred many years ago. The NAACP's Clarence Mitchell looked Thurmond in the eye and countered that the injustices were hardly alleged, but in fact well documented. We could fill this room with a record of discrimination in the state of South Carolina, Mitchell informed the senator, nor was Thurmond's many years ago accurate. At every turn in the civil rights struggle, the NAACP's representative asserted, South Carolina has fought us all the way. Indeed, in 1966, 1 year after the VRA had passed, the state went before the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that the Voting Rights Act infringed on states' rights, had illegally inserted federal registrars in counties that had literacy tests, which had been outlawed by the VRA, and presumed the state's guilt simply because far into the 20th century, only 0.8% of South Carolina's voting-age Black population was registered to vote. As Mitchell well knew, the court's South Carolina versus Katzenbach decision dismantled every one of the state's arguments and found the VRA constitutional. Now, it appears that we have won, Mitchell observed. We don't want to have a situation develop where the White House gives back to South Carolina all the rights to discriminate that we have succeeded in wresting from them. The House and Senate agreed, refused to scuttle the single most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever passed by Congress, and instead renewed the Voting Rights Act for another 5 years. Still, the Attorney General's initial thrust had made it all too clear how vulnerable the VRA was now, with its very strength, the increase in Black voting, exposing its political jugular. Under the right circumstances and in the right venue, the vaunted Voting Rights Act could be taken down. The Nixon administration turned its sights as well on Brown, which was already weakened by massive resistance and the subsequent tactic of stall and undermine. Almost 15 years after the landmark Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, Mississippi, ever recalcitrant, had yet to desegregate its public school system. When on July 3rd, 1969, the federal court ordered the state to implement Brown by that fall, Nixon's attorney General, as well as his Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, convinced the judges to reserve the decision because, quote, time was too short and the administrative problems too difficult to accomplish before the beginning of the 1969 to 1970 school year, end quote. In other words, by rejecting the Cooper versus Aaron decision about the unacceptability of kowtowing to state-sponsored obstruction, the Department of Justice, in league with HEW, ignored that Mississippi had already had more than a decade to develop a plan. Nixon's 4 new appointments to the Supreme Court would follow through by eviscerating the constitutional right of Black children to an education and then some. As vacancies opened on the bench, the president was drawn to the law and order writings of Warren Burger, who would replace Earl Warren as Chief Justice. Nixon also approved of the strict constructionist decisions and Southern roots of Virginian Lewis Powell, and remained impressed by the, quote, moderately conservative philosophy, end quote, and relative youth, at 47 years old, of William Rehnquist. The most contentious battles came over 2 of Nixon's Southern nominees, Clement Haynesworth, a laundered segregationist in the opinion of Joseph Rao, counsel to the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, and G. Harold Carswell, who had ruled that, quote, segregation of the races is proper and the only practical and correct way of life in our states, end quote. After a bruising series of confirmation hearings, the Senate rejected both. Nixon then turned to his default choice, a Northerner, Harry Blackmun. Admiring his handiwork years later, the president reflected, I consider my 4 appointments to the Supreme Court to have been among the most constructive and far-reaching actions of my presidency. The men I appointed shared my conservative judicial philosophy and significantly affected the balances of power that had developed in the Warren Court. This was an understatement even for Richard Nixon. The court's subsequent decisions shut down access to quality education while allowing blatant racial discrimination to run rampant in criminal procedures. It is never going to make me less angry or any less angry knowing that the Supreme Court essentially can be padded by the President of the United States based off of their values. 2 important 5-4 Supreme Court decisions in which Nixon's appointees were in the slim but decisive majority undercut the possibility that Brown would ever be fully implemented. The first was the 1973 San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez case. Parents from an impoverished, overwhelmingly minority neighborhood took Texas to court because of full school funding mechanism, which relied on property taxes, created such disparate revenues as to make equal educational opportunity impossible. Of course, the value of property, on which school funding was heavily based, it derived from government enforcement of residential segregation and discriminatory housing laws, as well as a series of public policy and zoning decisions, such as where to put landfills, erect sewage treatment plants, allow liquor stores, and approve industrial plants. Zoning had a particularly deleterious effect on the Edgewood neighborhood of San Antonio, which was 96% Mexican American and Black. That section had the lowest property value in the city, as well as the lowest median income. So committed were the parents to their children's education, however, that they voted for school levies that taxed their property at the highest rate in the area, which even then generated only $21 per student per academic year. Whereas the affluent, predominantly white San Antonio neighborhood of Alamo Heights, whose property tax rate was significantly lower than Edgewood's, still produced enough revenue to expend $307 per pupil. Or to put it another way, Alamo Heights secured nearly 1,500% more in funding with a significantly lower tax rate. 1,500% more. Seeing the inequity, the parents in Edgewood screamed foul and sued. The U.S. District Court, using Brown as a template, agreed. In a survey of 110 school districts throughout the state, the judges found that while the wealthiest districts in Texas taxed their property at 31 cents per $100, the poorest were burdened with a rate of 70 cents. Nevertheless, the district court continued even with their low tax rate. The rich districts netted $525 more per pupil than than the poor districts did. Clearly, the judge concluded, Texas' funding scheme makes education a function of the local property tax base. The district court therefore ruled that education is a fundamental right, that the state's use of wealth was a synonym for race and thus subject to judicial strict scrutiny, and that Texas's funding scheme was irrational and violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. As the case moved up to the U.S. Supreme Court, Texas pleaded racial innocence and claimed not only that it was meeting the bare minimum requirements for access to education, but also that it could not and should not be held responsible for the differences between what poor districts and wealthy ones amassed. Nixon's four appointees to the court, as well as Potter Stewart, who had been tapped by Eisenhower, agreed. In a March 1973 ruling that pulled the rug out from under Brown, they found that there is no fundamental right to education in the Constitution. The justices concluded, too, that the state's funding scheme did not systematically discriminate against all poor people in Texas. And because reliance on property taxes to fund schools was used across the country, the method was not so irrational as to be individuously discriminatory. For the court, then, the funding scheme in which, for example, Chicago allocated $5,265 for African American pupils, while the adjacent suburban school district of Niles appropriated $9,371 per student, was perfectly constitutional. Thus, despite the same kinds of rampant funding disparities that had led to Brown, Justice Lewis Powell declared that he saw no discriminatory public policy at all. With residential segregation no longer enforced by the government, whites and minorities alike, he felt, were free to move wherever they wanted in search of better schools. The fact that most minorities, after centuries of government-forced racism in education and employment, simply did not have the economic wherewithal to move was overlooked. How often do you see somebody that is bringing up what is happening in this world and saying that this country is not taking care of its people? And the response is, well, you can just leave. Especially to Black Americans, you can just leave. You can just leave. Nobody's keeping you here. Never mind the fact that, again, we have been put at so many disparities, racial disparities, that leaving is not an easy option to do. And this is back. This is not new. And so even in the waning days of the civil rights movement, entrenched, constitutionally unequal education was once again an important part of the nation's way of life. The Equal Protection Clause does not require absolute equality, Powell declared in a powerfully worded edict, or precisely equal advantages. What was at work here was class, not race. And class, unlike race, was not a suspect category that required strict scrutiny. If Texas had a rational basis for its property tax system, the justices concluded, then the mechanism met judicial standards despite producing a 975% disparity in school funding between white and minority children in Texas. Fully recognizing the implications of Rodriguez, Justice Thurgood Marshall was apoplectic. More than 40% of Black children 14 and under lived with families below the poverty line, as compared with about 10% of white children. Under those circumstances, Marshall feared African American children wouldn't stand a chance. The decision, he wrote in his dissent, could only be seen as a retreat from a commitment to equality of educational opportunity, as well as an unsupportable capitulation to a system which deprives children of the chance to reach their full potential as citizens. He was simply dumbfounded that the majority would acknowledge the existence of wildly disparate funding for schools across Texas, but then, instead of focusing on the cause of that disparity, clumsily pirouette to all of the state's supported efforts to close the gaps. The issue, Marshall explained, is not whether Texas is doing its best to ameliorate the worst features of a discriminatory scheme, but rather whether the scheme itself is in fact unconstitutionally discriminatory. Moreover, he found it the height of absurdity that Texas could actually argue that there was no correlation between funding and school quality, and then from that faulty premise deduce that there were, quote, no discriminatory consequences for the children of the disadvantaged districts, end quote. Given the slew of amicus curiae briefs flooding the court supporting Texas's school funding scheme against the poor's challenge, Marshall wryly observed that if, quote, financing variations are so insignificant to educational quality, it is difficult to understand why a number of our country's wealthiest school districts have nevertheless zealously pursued its cause before this court, end quote. He was equally unimpressed with Texas's tendency to parade before the justices stories of children who had excelled despite living in under-resourced districts as some sort of proof that funding was irrelevant, that a child could excel even when, quote, forced to attend an underfunded school with poor physical facilities, less experienced teachers, larger classes, and a number of other deficits compared with a school with substantially more funds, Marshall barked, is to the credit of the child, not the state. Rodriguez placed the onus solely on the backs of the most vulnerable while walling off access to the necessary resources for quality education, played beautifully into the colorblind post-civil rights language of substituting economics for race. Yet achieving a similar result, the simple truth was that by virtue of the sheer demographics of poverty, Rodriguez would have not only a disparate impact on African American children, but also a disastrous one. I want to go back to this line right here that says the colorblind post-civil rights language of the substituting economics for race. We're going to come back to that at the end of this in a recap as to how we're seeing this today. The next year, Nixon's Supreme Court appointees landed yet another powerful blow to Brown. This time the case emerged out of the North in Detroit, which by the early 1970s was a predominantly Black city surrounded by overwhelmingly white suburbs. The K-12 system mirrored the racial geography, with virtually all the schools in the city more than 90% African American. Those schools were overcrowded, sometimes with classrooms holding as many as 50 students, and buildings so decayed and unsafe that classes were taught in trailers parked on the school grounds. Vera Bradley, a Black mother of two sons, Richard and Ronald, wanted more for her children and turned to the NAACP for help. On August 18, 1970, Association General Counsel Nathaniel Jones filed suit in the federal district court on Bradley's behalf against a number of officials, including Governor William Milliken, because, Jones noted, these children were kept in schools that the Supreme Court said were unconstitutional. City leaders, hoping to have the case withdrawn, devised a number of plans to integrate the K-12 system, but as a district court noted, each scheme left the schools overwhelmingly identifiable racially, and Detroit even Blacker than before. The judge therefore ordered a metropolitan Detroit desegregation plan that spread beyond the city's borders. The suburbs immediately protested. The U.S. Supreme Court, however, calmed their fears. Just as Rodriguez ensured that funding in overwhelmingly white suburbs would never leak into the city schools, Milliken versus Bradley in 1974 ensured that whites would not have to attend schools with African Americans. To accomplish this feat, the court had to ignore the role the law played in residential segregation, white flight, discriminatory public policy that financed, subsidized, and maintained white suburbs, and legislation that drew and redrew boundaries and curtailed transportation options, redlining, and keeping Black children trapped in impoverished cities and subpar schools. 5 justices held there was no evidence whatsoever that the outlying school districts had discriminated against Blacks or been responsible for the racially distinct condition of inner city Detroit. And if the suburbs were not part of the problem, the court reasoned, then they could not be part of the solution. Then, as if to underscore the full retreat from Brown, the justices emphasized the importance of local control of schools and chastised the district court for overstepping its bounds. In a final coup de grace, they added that Brown did not require, quote, any particularly racial balance in each school, grade, or classroom. Thurgood Marshall's dissent was a roaring eulogy to a once promising landmark decision. He was astounded at the majority's superficial reasoning that had now resulted in the emasculation of our constitutional guarantee of equal protection. Marshall balked at the notion of suburban innocence and scoffed at the contention that the Detroit public schools were locally controlled. The state of Michigan, he laid out, devised, tweaked, contorted, and in fact ran the K through 12 system. Michigan then had the power to consolidate school districts and chose time and time again to keep white suburban ones separate and distinct from those in the city. Moreover, Marshall pointed out, when the city tried to exert some authority to implement Brown, the state legislature, crushed Detroit's efforts. And while Michigan providing funding for buses in suburban schools, the same law actually banned the use of state transportation funds for students in the city of Detroit. This, Marshall noted, led to the construction of small walk-in neighborhood schools, which reflected to the greatest extent feasible extensive residential segregation. How the justices, given this firmly documented track record of discrimination, could absolve the state from responsibility for the racially divided metropolitan school system it created, Marshall had no idea. It simply flies in the face of reality. For Marshall, the court's decision had less to do with the neutral principle of law than it did with public sentiment that we have gone far enough in enforcing the Constitution's guarantee of equal justice. The consequences of this kind of cowardice for the United States, he warned, are a course our people will ultimately regret. As Black access to quality public schools drifted further and further away, entrance into colleges and universities, increasingly essential in America's post-industrial economy, became even more difficult as well. Thanks in no small part to the Supreme Court's 1978 Bakke decision. Alan Bakke, a white male, had applied to the University of California, Davis Medical School and was turned down twice. Bakke sued, arguing that the university's quota system allowed the admission of Blacks and Latinos who had lower MCAT scores than his. There were, of course, whites who had also gained entry into the medical school program with scores lower than Bakke's, but their interest was not the focus of his suit. Nor was the medical dean's tendency to guarantee admission to a number of his friends and politicians' children, despite their lack of qualifications. Admissions based on alumni connections and high-level friendships, while generally dovetailing with whiteness, were not explicitly based on race and therefore not subject to strict scrutiny. Instead, the university's policy to admit 16 Blacks and Latinos in a class of 100 Bakke charge that had denied him equal protection under the law. 16 out of 100 students. In the highly contentious and fractious 4-1-4 decision, a plurality of judges agreed, demanding concrete evidence that Black students who had been admitted had personally been discriminated against by the university. The 5 justices further asserted that they would only countenance the use of race in admissions for well-defined diversity purposes, while preferring the broader, more multicultural scope of disadvantage, which would, for example, recognize what a farm boy from Idaho could bring to Harvard. Finally, they focused the court's concern on the reverse discrimination heaped on whites applying to colleges and universities who, like Bakke, bore no responsibility for any wrongs suffered by minorities. As for admissions policies designed to atone for past discrimination against minorities, Justice Byron Wright was unequivocal. I do not accept that position. Attempting to observe the law while also living up to an ethos that had now taken to heart, universities frantically turned to vaguer notions of diversity. But the definition of that word soon became so expansive that by the 21st century, white males would actually be the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action in college admissions. Even as a court rejected history, Thurgood Marshall's dissent in Bakke recounted 350 years of the most pervasive and ingenious forms of racial discrimination against African Americans. He then expressed belief that the court would deny California the right to apply a remedy in the face of that kind of sordid history. Astounded as Marshall may have been, though, the decision viewed through the opposite lens made calculated sense. African Americans had rushed right through the barely open door of opportunity pushed ajar by the civil rights movement. From 1970 to 1978, the number of Blacks enrolled in college had literally doubled. And in just a little more than a decade, the percentage of African Americans who had a college degree climbed to 6% from 4%. A combination of their own determination and aspiration, coupled with the protections of affirmative action, which actively sought Black students rather than shutting them out, and federal student financial aid, which helped defray tuition costs for people overwhelmingly impoverished, had significantly changed the game. Nixon's policies and the Supreme Court choices had set the stage to reverse those gains. Much of this reversal, though, would not be carried out until the Reagan administration. And that's a good place to stop, because if you know anything about me, then you know that Ronald Reagan, just the mention of his name will send me into a rage. So this portion of the chapter that we're reading, that we're going over, the rolling back civil rights, it really is as simple as the different lawmakers doing everything they can to take away any type of protection that Black Americans had, which was little to none to begin with. Blaming the people in their neighborhoods where they lived for the diminishing or the lack of education, redlining places in Detroit to keep Black people more impoverished, to keep Black people away from access to travel, to transportation, to work, to school. All of these things were done because what they recognized is with the smallest amount of access, the smallest amount of protection, Black Americans have such a high amount of perseverance and tenacity that we should not have to have, but such a high amount of it that with that little bit, we're going to make the best that we can. And it's important to note that Black Americans, with given those protections, did not care about what was happening to white Americans. They just wanted to do the best for themselves. And I had said recently in a video that it's so difficult, or it's so interesting being a Black person in America, because we see how much we are hated. We see how much we are discarded. But when we do anything to try and stay away from the people that hate us, because it makes sense if you know that somebody hates you to stay away from them. When we try any of that, then we are confronted. Then we are confronted, and it seems like even more rights wanting to be taken away. I mentioned the language, the colorblind language, where it was now being based on class instead of race, and I wanted to come back to that. I mentioned also in a video yesterday, and when I say video on my TikTok, about this discourse that's happening right now with a person saying that they have $200 between paychecks and they're living paycheck to paycheck, and the amount of people that are being less than empathetic with this situation, and in some ways saying, well, I also have had it bad, and you can tell this person has never had it bad. Those conversations where you are saying you're not as poor as I am is exactly what the system wants to happen. They brought in class as a way to try to cover up the racism. Because if there's something that most everybody can agree on when it comes to talking about capitalism, you want to be better than the person next to you that is also poor. You want to be less poor than them. And that's not the argument to be had. Yes, we all want to be able to be comfortable, to be able to pay our bills, but also be comfortable to make sure that if something happens, we have the funding to take care of that, to be able to grant ourselves and our family the luxuries. We all want that. But the fight is not within ourselves. The fight is not within ourselves. The fight is with the people that make capitalism a thing. It's, again, I am struck with the fact that this chapter that we're reading on is so prevalent to what's happening in today's world, but here we are. Your journal prompts for you. Again, continue on with how you are seeing the correlation from the 1970s to today, how it's a continuation. I want you to also really think about, I want you to think about how we discussed the blame being shifted to the people and not the circumstances, or the blame being shifted to the neighborhoods where people lived and not the actual schooling, especially because it happened in Texas, which is where a bulk of our education comes out. So if we think critically, Texas and these educational games, and now with the educational system, what it looks like now. So think about that. And then I also want you to think about your role in capitalism. And for this part, I really want you to dig deep, because I can make these statements about how we're fighting with each other. And I can also make that statement and say that I am not completely innocent of perhaps making a statement like that in the past. Again, we are all unlearning and we're learning new things. So I want you to think about the time that maybe you got tricked by capitalism. We get tricked. We get tricked. We get tricked. We're taught that it's what is and what we have to follow and believe, and that's why it's our responsibility to decolonize and unlearn. So I want you to think about your role in capitalism, not the way that capitalism exists, because that's going to likely be beyond you, unless I've got somebody from the 1% listening. And if I do, thank you so much for being here. Um, but how you perpetuate the white supremacy portion of it, where you are playing into the very game of fighting the person next to you that is also in a similar situation for you, although it might look slightly different. Ultimately, what we're getting to here with these journal prompts is ways to decolonize. How have you participated in white supremacy in the past? How do you see it today? And what are your plans to step away from it? Thank you again for this. We have stopped, if you're reading along with me, we stopped on page 118. There's a break before we move into the Reagan portion of this, and we will pick it up next week. Thank you again for being here.